Okay. So this PowerPoint is really just going to talk about migration. I've shared this with you on Google Classroom as well, and you'll need to make a copy of it for your iBook also. I think it's going to be entry number 11. Okay, so just make sure to do that. Remember, you want to file, make a copy, okay, and get that put on your iBook too. Okay, so we talked about population pyramids and then we talked about the DTM, but now we need to talk about migration and get Ravenstein's laws in as well. So that's what I'm going to go through with this PowerPoint. All right, so when you're looking at the diffusion of people or of the human settlement, okay, so that wherever people settle, wherever they decide to migrate to, remember they always try to pick a place that's fairly easy to live in. Okay, so that's called ecumene. Okay, so that's what that word right there is, ecumene, right there. Okay, and so ecumene is the part of the earth that people live in. Okay, so that's the permanent human settlement piece. Okay, and when you compare it to the entire earth, it's a pretty small area because remember, there's mountains and deserts and then all the water as well. So all of that, like we humans, they don't choose to live in those parts. Okay, so ecumene is the little piece that people actually do settle in. Okay, so and then to accomplish the spread across Earth, humans have permanently changed their place of residence. That's the migration part. Remember, people travel for really long periods of time, but that's not migration. That's tourism. Okay, so it's got to be that permanent settlement that when they choose to move and then they permanently settle somewhere, that's migration. Okay, so think about how many times your family has moved. Okay, especially here in Frisco, because Frisco is such a new growth city. Remember when we looked at Frisco's population pyramid, we talked about how fast Frisco grows. So think about how many times you and your family have moved. Okay, I think I've moved like 7 times. Most of that was in college though. But and then think about what that move was like. Was it and you don't have to say, but was it for a bad reason? Was it traumatic? Or was it exciting? Was it looked at as a new opportunity? Okay, and then think about people today that choose to make these really dangerous journeys across thousands and thousands of miles. Why they would choose to do that versus just stay in some of the places that they're living in. And then also think about why people choose to migrate today. And I think that you could definitely argue that for most of those people, a lot of the times it's for an economic reason. Okay, so better jobs or a job or higher paying jobs, things like that. So when we look at why people migrate, we can classify those into 2 different types of migration. We can classify it into forced migration or voluntary migration. Okay, so forced migration is just that. It's when somebody forces a group of people or people out of their home. Okay, so, and it's usually the government that does it, but sometimes it could be like an opposing force. Okay, so maybe like one group is forcing another group out of the country or of their homes or of an area. Okay, and then voluntary migration is when you weigh your options. Do I want to live in city A or do I want to move to city B where there's better paying jobs or more jobs or better places to live or better education, just all around better? Okay, so that's a voluntary migration. All right, now sometimes a migration can be seen as both ways, both forced and voluntary. Really though, and this is just my opinion, I don't really see it that way. I think if it's a forced migration and your choice is either stay or you stay or move, because if you stay, somebody Like you could die, okay, because there's maybe conflict in the country. To me, that's not really a choice. That's forced migration. But I can also understand how people see it in different ways. Now, there's two types of migrants, okay? So, and this is really a matter of perspective, but one type of migrant is an immigrant with an E. Okay, so this is when a person is moving away from a country or an area. Okay, so it's an out migrant. So the way I like to remember it is an immigrant with an E is exiting, okay, the country. So they both start with E. Okay, and then, so, all right, so if a person living in the U.S. decides to move to Brazil, okay, that would be an immigrant with an E to us because they're exiting the U.S. Okay, and then the other type is an immigrant with an I. Okay, and that's a person that's migrating into a particular country or area. Okay, so it's an in-migrant. All right, so a person from Brazil moving to the U.S. would be an immigrant with an I to us because they're coming into the country. Okay, so just, that's how I remember those two. So immigrant with an E is exiting the country. Immigrant with an I is coming into the country. Okay, so here are some historic examples of forced migration. All right, so, and I'm not going to go through all these because these are, we've talked about these, or you've talked about these in a history class. But like the slave trade would be a forced migration. Britain used to actually they started Australia as a prison colony. So they used to actually ship their convicts over to Australia. We even have an example here in the U.S. when the U.S. government forced Native Americans off their land. So that would be a forced migration. Okay. Even with during the Holocaust, during World War II, when the Nazis forced the Jews out of portions of Western Europe. But then you can also look at counter migration as forced migration. Okay. So when governments send back migrants that are caught in the country illegally. So this is also known as deportation. Okay, but our technical term that we use for that is the counter migration. But counter migration doesn't have to be negative. Okay, so you should have read, with chapter 5, counter migration can also just be like a, when immigrants go back. Okay. Okay. So current day examples though, and these are important. Okay. It's really important to know the difference between refugees, asylum seekers, and IDPs. Okay. So let's talk about the differences between those. Internally displaced persons, internally displaced persons, those are IDPs. Okay. So think about what that means. Internal, okay, so that's inside, and then displaced, okay, so put in a new spot, right? Okay, so IDPs, or internally displaced persons, these are people that are still inside their country, okay? They did not cross any borders. So I'm going to put that, didn't cross borders. Okay, so this would be like if somebody came to your home and like kicked you out, okay, and made you leave. Okay, so you're still in the U.S., you're just not at home. Okay, so that's an IDP. Okay, so we see, we actually have really high numbers of IDPs in Syria because of the conflict and the civil war that was going on there. Okay, so IDPs, they don't leave the country, but they're not at home. Okay. And it's a life or death. Okay. It's a life or death thing. All three of these are. Okay. Now, an IDP may decide that, yes, okay, we're going to cross the border. Okay. So then they might become an asylum seeker. Okay. So cross border. Okay. Now, here's the thing with an asylum seeker, though, is that a country will take in asylum seekers. Okay. So they're not illegal. Okay, they're not undocumented migrants. They have documentation, but the thing about asylum seekers is they kind of sit in limbo for a little bit, okay, until a country decides to give them full refugee status. Okay, so asylum seekers are those that they are under the protection of this new country. Okay, so but they can't work, go to school, buy an apartment or buy a house, rent an apartment, none of that. Okay, because they're not that full legal status yet. They're not illegal. I don't want you guys to think that. They're just under the protection of a government until kind of like they decide what to do with them. Okay, now a refugee, that's full legal status. And they are in an entirely new country. Okay, so they do cross the borders. Okay, so a refugee is under protection of the new government. Okay, they don't ever have to go back to their other country, but that's just the thing. They can't ever go back to their old country. Okay, so refugees are refugees knowing that they'll never go home again. Okay, but they have full legal status in the country, in the new country. Okay, so they can, work, they can go to school, they can buy a house, rent an apartment. They have that full legal status. But, it comes with knowing that they'll never be able to go back home again because they became a refugee of a new country. Okay, so just kind of remember those differences. All right, so IDPs, they don't cross borders. Asylum seekers cross borders, but they're in limbo. And refugees cross borders, but they have full legal status now and can never go back home. Okay, and so we have high numbers of those in Syria, Afghanistan, and also the Palestinians as well. Okay, so and we'll talk more about those when we get into our political unit because it's more of a political thing. Okay, but just know that that's the difference between those. Okay. All right, so now if it's voluntary migration, that's where your push and your pull factors fit in. Okay, so push factors, they're always negative. Okay, always negative. All right, so think about like if somebody pushes you. Okay, it makes you feel like a negative feeling. Okay, so push factors are negative things that happen in a country or in a city. It could even be as low as or small as a city. Okay, so these would be things like, no jobs or low paying jobs, or maybe there's conflict or high crime rate. Maybe it's overcrowded, so like overpopulation. Okay, so think negative things that would be going on in the country that would cause somebody to be pushed out. Now, for every push factor, there's a pull factor, and these are always positive. Okay, so if one city pushes you out, right, because there's no jobs, okay, then the other city will pull you in because there's new high-paying jobs. Okay, bad education is a push factor. A pull factor would be a good education. Okay, so they're always opposites of each other. So voluntary migration is also where Ravenstein's laws of migration come in. And I want to say there's actually 12 of those laws, but we're just going to talk about 6 of them. These are like the 6 main ones. Okay, so all right, so the first one says every migration flow generates a return or counter migration. So a lot of times, immigrants might come into a country to work and then they go back home. Or you could even look at it as like a lot of times some immigrants will come into a country while people in that country actually leave and go to another country. Okay, so that's the return or the counter migration. Okay, and deportation would even fit in that as well. Okay, and then the second one, number 2, the majority of migrants move a short distance. So this is when, think about distance decay, think about step migration, think about intervening obstacles or opportunities. Okay, so they usually move a short distance because that's the easiest thing to do, right? A lot of times, though, they'll choose to go to the closest MDC. Okay, so while we're the closest MDC to Latin America, this is why we see lots of Latin American immigrants in the U.S. But like in Europe, they see lots of immigrants from like North Africa or even Asia, maybe more so the Middle East. And then like Australia, we'll see lots of immigrants from like East and Southeast Asia, especially Southeast Asia. Okay, because those are the closest MDCs. It's the shortest. Okay, now distance decay comes into that. They won't, like the farther away something is, if that's their end goal. So let's say someone from Mexico is trying to make it to maybe New York. Okay, they might stop in Texas first, then they would take that in steps. Okay, so that's the step migration. So they might work in a big city in Texas first, then maybe they'll move north and work in another big city until they finally do make it into New York. Okay, so step migration really is exactly how it sounds. It's migration in steps. Okay, and then sometimes though they might plan to go to New York. But maybe like an intervening opportunity or an intervening obstacle happens in Texas and they just never make it there and they just decide to stay. Okay. But distance decay is like a lot of times you won't see immigrants from Mexico in say like the UK because it's such a far distance. Okay. So and it would be too far from home. Okay. So that's distance decay. It's just too far so that it makes that trip less likely. Okay, and then number 3 says migrants who move longer distances tend to choose big city destinations, which makes sense because big city destinations or big cities, they're known worldwide. Okay, like everybody knows New York, everybody knows LA. Think about international cities that we know about, London, Paris, Berlin, Tokyo. Okay, so Sydney, you can even go to Australia. Okay, so we know those cities. Well, it's not just us, the whole world knows those cities. So migrants tend to choose those cities because it's, I don't want to say familiar, but it's well known. So it feels more comfortable. Okay. Plus think about big cities, that cities are where the opportunities are. It's where you'll find the most jobs, the most infrastructure, things like that. And so it's a better opportunity for them. Okay, and then 4, urban residents are less migratory than inhabitants of rural areas. So that kind of goes along with the big city destinations, okay, because think about urban, that city, that's where all your opportunities are. You're less likely to leave a big city because you're already exposed to those opportunities versus people in rural areas. I mean, remember, rural has less infrastructure, less opportunities, less jobs, things like that. So they would feel less, tied down to that area and feel more free to move on. Okay, and then number 5 says families are less likely to make international moves than young adults. So that makes sense too, because if you're traveling with a big family, that's going to be harder to do. Okay. So, you're going to have to find schools and jobs for everybody. Okay. Versus if it's just a single young adult, then that's easy to do. It's just you that you're worried about. And a lot of times the young adults, not all the time, especially as, things catch up with the times as we're in today, but a lot of times these young adults are men. Not all the time, but if it's an international move, then it's men. International. Okay. But if it's within the country, okay, within, that's not how you spell within. Okay, if it's within the country, then it's women. Okay, so like in Mexico with all the maquiladoras close to the U.S. border, they employ a lot of women, young women, okay, because women are the ones that are more likely to move from a rural area to an urban area within a country. But men will be the ones that make that extra step and they go across the border. Okay, so men mostly international, women mostly within the country. Okay, and then the last one, 6, the major causes of migration are economic. I mean, let's think about this, especially if you moved. Think about like how many times you moved or if you've had to move. And if that, I'm willing to go ahead and say that that's probably because of somebody's job. Okay, so people will tend to move for more money. They're offering you more money, then you'll most likely move or make that move. Okay, so major causes of migration are economic. Okay, so with this last slide, just think about which one is push or which one is pull. And so, okay, so remember push, those are always negative. Okay, and then pull, those are always positive. Okay, so let's think about this for poverty. Would that be a push or would that be a pull? Okay, hopefully you said push. Okay, what about armed conflict? Okay, that's a push. Military dictatorships, really any dictatorships, would that be a push or a pull? Okay, that's a push. Job openings. That's a pull. Culture clashes, so like one culture fighting another culture. That's a push. Hurricanes, or really any natural disaster. Push. Good schools. That's a pull for sure. New homes. That's a pull. Democratic elections. For sure, that's a pull. And then overpopulation, so it's crowded. That's a push. Okay, so remember, I did share this with you on Google Classroom, this Google Slides. So just make sure that you get on there and you get that presentation and you make a copy. Remember, you gotta make a copy. Okay, and then load that to your iBook. All right, so that'll be the next entry. That's entry 11. Okay, guys, that's it.